My name is Michael Lawrence, and welcome to Getting Started. We're looking at the book of Esther today, an amazing story from a very unfamiliar world. It's told with extraordinary artistry and even humor, though the themes it deals with are quite dark. Perhaps the greatest challenge of the book is that God is never mentioned, and yet it's almost impossible to miss his presence. As God's people today, living in a deeply secular world in which God seems to be absent, Esther's message of God's faithfulness is a message we need to hear. We want to take some time today in Esther because getting started right will help you cut it straight. On its face, the book of Esther explains the origin and proper practice of Purim, one of only two festivals celebrated by the Jews that was not established by Moses. The other is Hanukkah. Esther, chapter 9, verse 28, says, "These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants." But the book of Esther is far more than an explanation of a festival. Like many Old Testament books, the book of Esther was written anonymously well after the events it records, in the second half of the 5th century BC. But the events of the book can be fairly precisely dated to 10 years during the reign of King Xerxes of Persia, from 483 to 473 BC. Xerxes' father was King Darius, the guy who threw Daniel into the lion's den. And Darius had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Athenians. In 483 BC, Xerxes convened a council of war to avenge his father's humiliation. Esther chapter 1 opens during that council. Now that date helps us place Esther and her world, with which we're unfamiliar, into a larger world with which we are somewhat familiar. In the East, Confucius is about to die, and in the West, Herodotus, who would chronicle the Persian Wars, had just been born. Socrates is about to be born, and Athens is in the golden age of Pericles, Sophocles, who wrote Oedipus Rex, and Thucydides. The Pythagorean theorem is just a few decades old. In other words, these are the years in which some of the most seminal thinking that will shape the respective cultures of East and West for millennia is happening. But from a biblical perspective, what's happening in Jerusalem during these years is at the center of what God is doing in world history. 40 years before Esther opens, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah had encouraged Zerubbabel and the people to complete the work on the temple they'd begun. 15 years after the events of Esther, Ezra will arrive in Jerusalem. And 20 years after him, Nehemiah will rebuild the walls. These are the decades in which God makes clear that he is a promise-keeping God, bringing his people back from exile and settling them in the land once more. But the return from exile isn't even mentioned in Esther. Esther is set in the city of Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. It's far from the center of action in Jerusalem. But from a secular perspective, it is the center of the world. Many of God's people are still there, living as exiles. But whether living in Jerusalem or in Susa, the Jews are living under Persian rule. And in the book of Esther, that rule threatens their destruction. This is what the book of Esther is about: the unexpected deliverance of the Jews from total annihilation throughout the Persian Empire. Without the events of Esther, the return from exile comes to nothing, and God's promise to restore his people fails. If the question facing the Jews back in Jerusalem is, what does it mean to be God's people now that we're back in the land? The question facing the Jews who remained in exile is even more pronounced. What does it mean to be God's people in a place where God seems completely absent? God is never mentioned or named in the book of Esther. There are no prayers to the Lord or words from him. There's barely even any religious practice. The setting is relentlessly pagan and secular. But given the question I just raised, that's a feature, not a bug. The entire story of the Old Testament comes full circle in Esther. Susa is not far from Ur, where Abraham first set out for the promised land. His descendants became a nation when God rescued them from the murderous intentions of a foreign king. Now the people are back where they started, the nation destroyed and in exile, and their existence again threatened by a foreign king. But unlike that initial call, and unlike the dramatic and miraculous rescue from Egypt in the Exodus, the deliverance this time would be utterly unexpected and seemingly devoid of miraculous intervention. Instead, the unseen hand of God, the seemingly absent God, would so direct ordinary events and human decisions to accomplish His perfect purposes for His people. Esther is a book about God's faithfulness to deliver His people, not through obvious and miraculous intervention, or even through His people's religious faithfulness, but through providence, the divine government of all things through secondary causes. As a result, it has much to say to us today, who live not in the days and of abundance of miracles, but nevertheless live under the rule and reign of the risen Lord Jesus Christ. Though unseen, He is with us always, as He said in Matthew 28, verse 20. And though we often cannot explain how, He works all things together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose. Let's talk about some of the themes of Esther. Esther is a book about the faithfulness of God. That might seem a strange thing to say, given that God is never mentioned. But though never seen, it's clear He's always in control. This comes closest to being said explicitly when Mordecai confronts Esther over her fear and hesitation to help the Jews in their hour of need. He says to her, "If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther 4, verse 14. God is not named, but Mordecai is certain that his promises will not fail. It's not God's faithfulness that's in question at that moment, but Esther's. In particular, the faithfulness of God is demonstrated through His providential government of human affairs. Over and over, things seem to happen serendipitously and coincidentally. Positions of power and influence unexpectedly become vacant and need to be filled at just the right moment. Not once, but twice. Reports are made, forgotten, and then recalled one night when, for some reason, the king couldn't sleep. The deck seems stacked against the Jews, but the tables are turned at the last minute when the intended means of their destruction becomes the means of their deliverance. While the peril is real and the stakes are high, the impression is inescapable. Behind every twist and turn is the sovereign Lord who cares for His people. Now, closely related to the theme of God's providential care for His people is the problem of the morally ambiguous heroes God uses to accomplish His purposes. Haman is clearly a wicked villain. Repeatedly, he's called the enemy of the Jews. King Ahasuerus, which is what King Xerxes is called in this book, is a bit of a fool. And so it's easy to think of Esther as a Disney princess, or Queen Vashti as a proud and stubborn woman. But on any account, Vashti qualifies as a #MeToo hero, refusing to be objectified for the male gaze. Esther, however, engaged in the sexual politics of the pagan Persian court to the fullest extent. Behind the scenes, Mordecai is guiding his adopted daughter, but he's hardly protecting her from the moral degradation of the court. The author of Esther almost never provides a moral evaluation of their actions. And as readers, we're often left in the dark as to their motivations. As a result, the main characters are not easily pegged as heroes or anti-heroes, and we often see true truths articulated for less than savory reasons. And yet, in the midst of the ambiguity, we also see behind the scenes God's good purposes. It's part of what makes this book so relevant for Christians today. Though it comes from an ancient culture not our own, explaining a holiday many of us have never heard of, it maps onto our experience perfectly, with all its ambiguity and mixture of human motives and purposes alongside God's perfect will. Finally, we should note the humor of Esther, because it is definitely a theme. Modern Jews celebrate Purim by reading the entire story and acting it out vaudeville style, with the audience cheering the heroes and booing the villains. While that might miss the nuance I just described, it faithfully captures the fact that Esther is a comedy, not a tragedy, a cause for laughter and joy, not weeping and sorrow. The humor is often ironic and at times quite dark. But it meets us first in the names of the characters, alerting us to the tone of the book. King Xerxes, as I mentioned, is called King Ahasuerus, which basically means king headache, and he causes a lot of them. Vashti means very beautiful lady. Haman means wrath, and Esther sounds like Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love and war. So we're prepared when the girl who pleased the king in the bedroom asks for a second day of slaughter at the end. While the characters are real figures from history, the author has named them humorously to help us understand the role they play in the story, much as Bunyan named his characters in Pilgrim's Progress. The subject matter of Esther is deadly serious. Attempted genocide, assassination, plots and intrigue, cutthroat court politics, holy war. But the humor alerts us that the outcome is not in doubt. Esther illustrates the psalmist's words in Psalm 126, verse 3, "The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad." That's not just the sentiment of the characters or even the first readers, but it's the reality of God's people today and always. While Esther is historical and corroborated by external sources, it's not a traditional chronicle of history, like 1st and 2nd Kings. Rather, it's presented as a narrative, more like a gripping novella or short story. The story is organized around 3 series of banquets or feasts, which is appropriate given its purpose of explaining the origin of the Feast of Purim. The feasts come at the beginning in chapters 1, 2, and 3, the middle, chapters 5, 7, and 8, and the end of the book in chapter 9. And each time these feasts are associated with a dramatic reversal of fortune. If we think of Esther as a play, it's a play with 3 acts, each act containing multiple scenes and its own set of banquets. Each scene, which roughly corresponds to the chapters, ends on a cliffhanger, which is part of the point. Not only does it emphasize the dramatic character of the story, but it underscores that behind all the seeming coincidences and dramatic turns is the unseen providence of God. Given the dramatic nature of Esther, plot is the most important tool for understanding the structure. Chapters 1 and 2 set the scene, introduce most of the main characters, King Ahasuerus, Mordecai the Jew, and Esther, and provide some key information that will drive the plot forward once the action begins, a bit like Chekhov's gun. Chapter 3 introduces the last main character, Haman, and with him, the problem that drives the whole story, the king's irrevocable edict to annihilate all of the Jews. Now the real action begins, as Mordecai urges Esther to take action to save her people. But how can the irrevocable be revoked? Chapters 4 to chapter 9, verse 19, record the rising tension as Esther hesitates and then resolves to risk her life on behalf of her people. But in the midst of Esther's plans, a new threat emerges, of which she is unaware: Haman's decision to have Mordecai executed. One of the most dramatic cliffhangers in the book comes at the end of chapter 5, when it seems that Esther's plan to save the Jews might work, but Mordecai won't live to see it. While chapters 7 through chapter 9 resolve the threats, first against Mordecai and then the Jews, chapter 6 is the moment when everything turns and Haman's downfall is assured. Significantly, neither Mordecai nor Esther have anything to do with it. While God is never mentioned, it's impossible to read of the king's unexplained insomnia and the particular bureaucratic records that are read to him to put him to sleep and not see God's providential hand at work. God is undoubtedly the main character in the book that never mentions his name. Chapter 9 records the ultimate resolution of the threat in the climax of the Jews' complete and total deliverance from their enemies on the day that would become the Feast of Purim. Chapter 9, verse 20, then through chapter 10 serve as the resolution and the new setting. The Feast of Purim is established by Mordecai and confirmed by Queen Esther, and Mordecai takes the place of Haman as second only to the king. In that role, he continued to pursue the prosperity of his people. And from then on, Purim would be a continual reminder of God's deliverance of his people in exile, the time that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, days of feasting and of gladness. How do we connect Esther's message to the gospel? I think there are several different strategies that we can use. The first is typology, a person, event, or institution providentially ordered by God to point forward to a greater spiritual reality. Both Esther and Mordecai, in different ways, stand as types of Christ. After deciding to intervene to save her people from their enemies, Esther tells Mordecai in chapter 4, verse 16, "If I perish, I perish." But Jesus didn't just risk his life, he gave it. And in effect said, "When I perish for my people, to save them from their sins." Mordecai, on the other hand, sits at the king's right hand on the other side of the great deliverance, not only issuing laws, but pursuing the prosperity and well-being of his people. Jesus, like a greater Mordecai, sits at the right hand of the Father after his resurrection from the dead, and even now rules his people and intercedes for them, securing forever their prosperity in a new heavens and new earth. Another strategy we can use is historical trajectory. Esther is very precise in its use of dates, since it's establishing a new feast. Haman's decree to destroy the Jews is written on the 13th day of the first month. That's the eve of Passover. If his plan succeeds, then not only will this be the last Passover the Jews celebrate, the meaning of Passover will have failed, because God in the end could not deliver his people to the end. Purim is celebrated on the 14th day of the 12th month, exactly 1 month before Passover. The yearly calendar, therefore, tells the story. Not only did God deliver his people initially from Egypt, but he delivered them finally from the Persians. In other words, he delivered them to the end. If the Passover finds its fulfillment at the cross, when Christ, the perfect Passover lamb, was sacrificed for us, then Purim points forward to the day of Christ's return, when every enemy is put beneath his feet. His people are welcomed to the wedding feast of the Lamb, and crying and sorrow are no more. As elect exiles, our hope is that Christ will deliver us to the end. One more strategy we might use is that of biblical and theological themes. Providence stands out as God worked through ordinary and unexpected means to deliver his people. Peter makes the same point in Acts chapter 2, verse 23. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. The cross is the ultimate demonstration and proof of God's sovereign and providential ruling of the affairs of men for the salvation of his people. Another theme that stands out is the ironic judgment of the wicked. The whole book of Esther, and especially the fate of Haman, is an illustration of Proverbs 11, verse 5. The righteousness of the blameless keeps his way straight, but the wicked falls by his own wickedness. The irony of the cross is that Christ, the truly blameless one, fell, not for his wickedness, but for ours. Whatever the strategy you use, remember that the message of Esther is a message of hope, that even when God seems absent, God is faithful to deliver his people. He has delivered us by the cross of Jesus, and he will deliver us to the end, when our days of sorrow are turned to gladness at Christ's return. Let's think for a moment about application. The book of Esther, with its profoundly secular and pagan setting, provides an opportunity to directly address issues that are front and center to our experience. In a post-#MeToo world, the treatment of Vashti and Esther provides an opportunity to speak to the way the world still treats women and how the gospel should change that. But it also gives us as preachers an opportunity to highlight the value, dignity, and personal agency of women inside the church and outside. By the end of the book of Esther, it's no longer Mordecai telling Esther what to do. She is acting for the good of her people, and we have an opportunity to empower the women in our churches to act the same. Another area of application not to be overlooked is the fact that following Christ in a fallen world can be messy. Sometimes the choices in front of us, like the choices that Esther and Mordecai faced, aren't easy or morally clear-cut. The book of Esther doesn't condone moral compromise, but nor does it pretend that every situation we face has an unambiguously right answer. Esther gives you an opportunity to equip your people to follow Christ faithfully in a world where it often seems nobody's hands are clean. But most of all, Esther points us forward to the hope of our final redemption at Christ's return. We live at a time of great tumult, politically, socially, and even within the church. It can seem like chaos reigns and everything is falling apart. Esther reminds us that even when we can't see it, God is firmly in control, and our deliverance is not in doubt. I hope this helps you get started with Esther, and I hope you find the opportunity to preach or teach this book soon. It's a powerful story of God's faithfulness to deliver His people, even when it seems He's not there. Our people need us to cut it straight with them. They don't need the false hope of the deliverance this world offers through politics or culture wars. They need God's word to them in Esther. I hope this helps you get started.